You said it's going to be 18?
I don't know what day it's due. 19th? Okay. 19th. Okay. All right. Okay, so if there's no further questions about the close reading paper, and as I said, there are examples for the close reading paper. Yeah, you had a question.
Where are the examples at? Is it under files or?
No. Everything should be under modules.
Okay.
So if you go under modules, that's the best way to handle what I do because it copies over from class to class, and since I've taught this before, it works that way. And I remember looking that there are close reading examples up there under modules. It has its own heading. It may be kind of down far, but you'll find it. If you don't find it, please email me and I'll put them up. I'm going to also try to put a couple more up even because I have several, having done it many times. Okay. If there's are there any other questions? Okay. So I'd like to then cut ahead to the second generation of Romantic poets. And we kind of did this last time by dealing with Byron. What we did was we looked at the way Hazlitt thought about Byron and looked back to Wordsworth. And I sort of suggested that this is a good way for us to conceptualize the second generation of Romantic poets who are going to be looked on in terms of the sort of fixed establishment. The second generation is going to be looked on as being more problematic, more politically transgressive, more aesthetically, or in terms of their art production, more transgressive. They're going to be the problem children of Romanticism, namely Byron, Keats, and Shelley. And we talked about Lord Byron last time, and we read a little bit of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. And I apologize to you for not giving you more Byron. I think the next time I teach the class, I will teach one of his plays called Manfred. But it's so heavily Romantic era based right now, this long survey, and that's because I'm trained as a Romanticist, so I see everything rising out of Romanticism. That's why you get it this way, but that's the reason I feel like I couldn't in all good conscience give you the whole play to read. But I may do that next time. The main thing I wanted to sort of suggest for you is out of Byron, we get this thing called the Byronic hero. And that is the figure of Childe Harold, or the figure of Don Juan, or the figure of Manfred. In some of his other poems, you get even further incarnations of this kind of person who seems to seem a little like Byron, but is a little bit different. And this idea of the Byronic hero becomes a way for us to think about a very early attempt at getting around the lyrical subject, the kind of heavy subjective eye. So the Byronic hero is a way to anticipate what will become, in the Victorian era, the dramatic monologue. So I'm just kind of signposting this for you because we're going to get to the dramatic monologue this week, in fact. We'll be jumping into Victorian poetry. I'm sorry, next week, next Monday. Monday, we will be jumping into Victorian poetry. That's this huge packet I have for you here, and we'll be jumping into it. So what that means is I'm just trying to give you a signpost that Byron makes possible through this kind of splitting that he does of himself into a kind of like poetic self, like you can imagine a Wordsworth or a Keats, directly speaking their expression, or even a Shelley, and an actor doing a role. Somewhere in between those two things, you get this Byronic hero, which becomes the dramatic monologue, the voice of someone who we know is not the speaker, and therefore can say more things because we know it isn't the speaker. Anybody see the movie Borat? Okay, so that's an example of somebody playing, can say a lot more than that particular comedian could have said because it's playing a role and kind of get away with it, right? In a certain sense, it's a sort of version of the dramatic monologue. This picture, as I said before, I think Byron fits perfectly with the figure of somebody like David Bowie. who kind of constantly changes his persona. He's Ziggy Stardust from Ziggy Stardust, and he's the thin white duke. He kind of changes who he is, but it's never quite, all the way, never quite all the way Bowie, but it's kind of Bowie, right up to the end when he did his last final, things, and he was dying, and he did his last record. He was kind of changing up, not letting you see all the way who he was. Okay, that's enough about the Byronic hero. I want to talk about Shelley. And so basically what we'll do today, I'm certain, is not get any farther than Shelley and Keats. You have Felicia Hemans in your packet. I won't talk much about her, I don't think. We will talk about John Clare, I promise, next week, because we have to. He's the only true peasant poet of this whole group, the only true poor working poet we have. The rest are pretty much middle class and above, right? So I think it's important that we pay that, and also because Claire's an amazing poet, just an amazing poet. But and Hemans not so much, but she's really interesting for other reasons. But I promise we will. I know we won't get any farther than I won't get any farther than Shelley and Keats. And I barely scratched the surface with them. I mean, if you take an upper division romanticism class with me, we really go into depth with these writers, but we can't do it here. So, Percy Bysshe Shelley, we've already talked a little bit about him, this radical kind of figure. He marries Shelley kind of later. Everyone got a copy of this letter by John Keats? And did you get a copy of the readings for today? No? Percy Bysshe Shelley, this radical figure, he's born into the aristocracy. He basically finds a way, well, not quite the upper middle class, the aristocracy, I suppose. He finds a way out of it by being more or less disowned by his father. He still got some family money from time to time, so he was never really poor, and was able to kind of put a life together for himself without having to really work, which was the goal in the 18th and early 19th century. To be a true artist meant that you really didn't have to work too much for a living, right? You just kind of lived off of your name. The way he got in trouble and kicked out of Oxford was for publishing a pamphlet called Why I Am an Atheist, I think is what it's called. And he co-wrote it with somebody else. He was a young guy, 19 years old, whatever. He never recanted this point of view. And yet there seems to be a real deep interest in Shelley in things that are quite spiritual, even religious. He writes a really amazing text on Jesus Christ. He writes a really amazing text on the spirit of Christianity. And yet he remains kind of spiritual but not religious, and against the church for the same reasons Blake was against the church, because he saw it as oppressive, and specifically oppressive to individual freedoms and part of the kind of state apparatus. He didn't see any separation between the kind of what King Charles and the state was doing and what the church was supporting. He saw them as being equal, and so that was his reason for being against them. He writes for a while, and he gets involved in a lot of different causes, but he doesn't really fully develop as a poet, I don't think, until about around 1815. And then he really starts to develop very quickly. And he has his own voice. And he's part of a whole coterie of writers hanging around someone named Leigh Hunt, who I mentioned before, whose brother was the main publisher for a radical press in London. So both Leigh Hunt and his brother spent considerable time in jail, because remember I told you there were these sedition laws. You were not allowed to say anything critical of the king, or you were not allowed to say anything critical of the state, or you would be imprisoned. And this was in, the greatest democracy, really, at that point, thought of as the greatest democracy in the Western world. But they kind of got away with it because they said, well, we've been in wartime. These are people who are speaking treason, right? That was the language that was being used. So All right. So let's go ahead and read some Shelley. The first thing I'll say about Shelley is that, well, I've said a bit, but the next thing I'll say about Shelley is that Shelley basically, to my way of thinking, has two modes, right? He has the ecstatic mode, and he has the political mode. And what happens with Shelley is that they usually end up intersecting in this way. So what starts as an ecstatic poem like Blanc, it begins here, it kind of travels to the area of the political. Same thing here, England, 1819, or Mask of Anarchy, or I'm trying to think of some other poems. They're not coming to me right now that are really Ozymandias, that begin as political poems. They sort of find their way over to the spiritual. So there's a way in which there's an interaction between these two modes. The poem that shows this best is this poem that begins your packet called Mont Blanc. But it's a very long and difficult poem, and as much as I'd love to do it, I feel that it will not allow us to move forward in this particular class enough. So I'm going to just bracket it for you and tell you that probably there'll be a question on the midterm or the final about Mont Blanc.
Will it be about any of the formatting of Mont Blanc?
Yeah, no, it will not be. That's a really difficult poem. It has a really, really idiosyncratic rhyme scheme. It actually is almost entirely contingent upon what he's feeling at the moment, it seems. It's very difficult to figure out. People have tried to reason the rhyme scheme, and I don't think we can. No, I think if I point out Mont Blanc to you, it's more or less to talk about this kind of complication of ecstatic mode and the political mode and the way they come together. So in this poem, I'll just talk about it really briefly and we won't read it, but in this poem where he addresses Mont Blanc, and this should be familiar to you from Frankenstein, this poem is quoted in the novel, and this is the scene of the sublime, as we've said many times. And Shelley stands before the sublime not as one who is kind of beaten down, but as one who's a little bit like, I'm going to stand up to this sublime. So he definitely articulates over and over. I mean, if we think about the way it begins, right? This beautiful line, the everlasting universe of things flows through the mind. What I want you to catch there is he doesn't say it flows through my mind, or it flows through your mind. It flows through the mind. For Shelley, that is the way I think his kind of like atheist spirituality plays itself out, as a kind of collected, interconnected, almost, there's a philosopher named Spinoza, almost like a Spinozaist kind of interconnection of all things. That's the way Shelley sees things. Remember how Wordsworth was a little bit that way, but he was also a little bit conservative? Imagine that you have a Wordsworth and you take all holes are barred. Shelley is completely that way. He believes in a complete kind of interconnection of all things, right? Even pronouns, he says, he'd be interested in this period of time where we don't like particular pronouns because they're too limiting. He was like, he says at one point in an essay called Defensive Poetry, the pronouns I, they, you, we, these are only different modifications of the same substance. Different modifications of the same substance. So what he believes really is that we are all interconnected. So the everlasting universe of things flows through the mind. And then he goes to say that that this Mont Blanc and the valley below it, he's looking at the valley and the mountain, that all of it somehow contains some kind of power. And he's trying to figure out where that power resides. Okay, so I'll leave it to you to follow the different places. I will point out, though, that he uses that poetic trope. That word, I don't know if you know that word, T-R-O-P-E. It just means like a figure of speech, but it's a kind of way of doing poetry. Like rhyme is actually a trope. Metaphor is a trope. metonymy is a trope. And what he uses here is apostrophe. Do you remember me talking about that? The direct address to something inanimate, missing, or dead. In this case, the ravine, the mountain, oh ravine, oh dizzy ravine. You know, he's constantly, it would be like, I was like, oh stack of papers, oh water bottle. It would be me kind of granting a certain energy and life to these things around me, which is the way he addresses. So he begins with that, but then he begins to say, like, where is this power, right? And so I'm now at stanza 3. So I'm on page 382, stanza 3. I just want to look, I'm not going to go through, he has such complicated and beautiful poetry. Like once you start reciting this, and by the way, I really, really encourage you, I know you're going to say, no, I won't do it, Ruderman, but if you read this aloud, you will never need to do drugs again. I mean, you can just do these poems, okay? It will be as satisfying, you won't have any bad effects, you know, any kind of addictive whatever, I'll take full credit for, and you don't have to worry about it, it won't hurt you. But it absolutely, so I'm not going to read through these things because they get complicated and it makes you want to not stop. You know, so I'm going to just point to what I want to point to, which is towards the end, lines 80 through the end of this stanza. He goes on to talk about this amazing scene, but then he says, now he addresses the mountain directly. Thou hast a voice, great mountain, to repeal large codes of fraud and woe, not understood by all, but which the wise and great and good interpret, or make felt, or deeply feel. So suddenly, in this middle of this poem, it's just ecstatic, like, you know, I love nature, it's amazing, isn't this great? In this kind of like hippie state, he kind of like puts the brakes on and goes into the political. You, mountain, like, it's almost like that's where he identifies the power is in the sublime. You have the power to repeal large codes of fraud and woe. And I think if we need to know what large codes of fraud and woe are, just drive down to parts of Newark or Columbus or whatever. You know what large codes of fraud and woe are. They're like the kinds of injustices and difficulties that we all live in. Many of us live in, some of us don't, but all of us know about, right? And in fact, I mean, obviously, go to Syria. You can really go and see way more large codes of fraud and woe, but it's the same basic premise, right? So what I'm trying to get at is he does that, and then at the end of the poem, if you look at the very end of the poem, which is, I'm sorry, not copied very well. It's kind of cool because it makes it hard to read. But like the very end of the poem, he says, the secret strength of things which governs thought, and to the infinite dome of heaven is as a law inhabits thee. He's still talking to the Mont Blanc. But what were thou, and earth, and stars, and sea, if to the human mind's imagining silence and solitude were vacancy? So at the end of Mont Blanc, he's already said that it has this amazing power, and he's what he basically says, you know, looking up at this ginormous mountain, is that even though it has this power, he says, what would your power be if my human imagination couldn't experience you? In other words, you would not have that power if my human mind couldn't experience you, right? So you see the way in which this is a radical reversal of where the power really resides. He understands that through the power of poetry, which he believes, I know it sounds crazy, he believes is a political force. He writes at the end of Defense of Poetry that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the universe. I just want you to notice that he doesn't say the world, he says the universe. Poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the universe. So in other words, poets make possible political change. Today you would probably say filmmakers, rappers, whatever, they make possible political change. I kind of believe that. I low-key believe that. I do. And so that's where he's at. That's what he's saying. He's saying at the end of this poem, boom, there's, what kind of power do you have if it weren't for us? And so if you extrapolate this metaphor out and you say, let's say he's standing in front of Parliament saying, well, what power do you have if it isn't for me, right, or for us? Right? That's the kind of, I think that's the move. Okay, any question just about that? I know that that's not dealing with the poem. The poem in its complexity is not the cartoon version I just gave you. It's much deeper, much more beautiful. I just gave it to you this way so that you would see the way in which the ecstatic and political get intertwined. That it's not even that they're different. It's like extapolable. It's like all in one thing. It's extrapolitical or polecstasy. Which do you like better? I don't know. I don't like either of them. Okay, but it's both of them put together, all right? All right, good. Okay, let's do, we will do this poem. We will do, skip Ozymandias, we're going to do Ode to the West Wind. And I'm going to cheat. I'm going to take a picture of some notes I made another time when I taught this so that I can go even faster, because we love speed here at The Ohio State University. We love speed. At Newark, we love speed only in the form of coffee, and we love statues, if you haven't noticed. We really like statues. I'm certain that the same woman posed for Joan of Arc as who posed for Amelia Earhart. They cannot be. They're the same person giving the same expression. But anyway, sorry about that. Also, I get confused. Never mind. Don't get me started. Don't get me started. You could then, it would be bad. Okay. All right, so I'm cheating a little bit here. I'm going to just sort of give you the form, and then I'm going to read it for you. I've already said this part about the two ecstatic political. The Ode to the West Wind is written in a kind of form called the terza rima. He gets this from a poet named Dante, who wrote the Divine Comedy. And terza rima is a really complicated form, and you can see the way that it's rhymed when you look at this poem. But what you see how I've got it written out here: ABA, BCB, CDC, DED, EE. Or no, G. I think that's EE. Yes, EE. But basically, I want to basically talk about how these stanzas. When you hear this poem, it's like you. It's like mostly build up. It's almost like entirely build up. So let's go ahead. I'll read it, and then we'll talk about it, and we'll go further. So there are a lot of great literary critical accounts of apostrophe from the mid-20th century onward. Remember, they have direct addresses, something living. This poem is figured in almost every one of them, okay? Because the apostrophe is a little bit crazy. He begins to, it becomes like, again, like I said before, the boundary between the object and the subject seems to disappear. All right. O wild west wind, thou breath of autumn's being, thou from whom unseen presence the leaves dead are driven like ghosts from an enchanter fleeing, yellow and black and pale and hectic red, pestilence-stricken multitudes, O thou who chariotest to their dark wintry bed the winged seeds where they lie old and low, each like a corpse within its grave, until thine eyes azure sister of the spring shall blow her clarion o'er the dreaming earth, and fill, driving sweet buds like flocks to feed in air with living hues and odors plain and hill. Wild spirit, which art moving everywhere, destroyer and preserver, hear, O hear. Thou, on whose stream mid the steep sky's commotion, loose clouds like earth's decaying leaves are shed, shook from the tangled boughs of heaven and ocean, angels of rain and lightning, they are spread on the blue surface of thine airy surge, like the bright hair uplifted from the head of some fierce maenad, even from the dim verge of the horizon to the zenith's height, the locks of the approaching storm, thou dirge of the dying year, to which this closing night will be the dome of a vast sepulchre, vaulted with all thy congregated might of vapors, from whose solid atmosphere black rain and fire and hail will burst. O hear. Thou, who didst awaken from his summer dreams the blue Mediterranean, where he lay lulled by the coil of crystalline streams, beside a pumice isle in Bai's bay, and saw in sleep's palaces and towers quivering within the waves' intenser day, all overgrown with azure moss and flowers so sweet, the sense faints picturing them. Thou, for whose path the Arctic level's powers cleave themselves into chasms, while far below the sea blooms and oozy woods which wear the sapless foliage of the ocean know thy voice and suddenly grow gray with fear and tremble and despoil themselves. O hear. If I were a dead leaf thou mightest bear, if I were a swift cloud to fly with thee, and a wave to pant beneath thy power and share the impulse of thy strength, only less free than thou, O uncontrollable. If even I were as in my boyhood, and could be the comrade of thy wanderings over heaven, and as then, when to outstrip thy skyey speed scarce seemed a vision, I would never have striven as thus with thee in prayer in my sore need. Oh, lift me as a wave, a leaf, a cloud. I fall upon the thorns of life, I bleed. The heavy weight of hours had chained and bowed one too like thee, tameless and swift and proud. Make me thy lyre, even as the forest is. What if my leaves are falling like its own? The tumult of thy mighty harmonies will take from both a deep autumnal tone, sweet though in sadness. Be thou spirit fierce, my spirit, be thou me, impetuous one. Drive my dead thoughts over the universe like withered leaves to quicken a new birth, and by the incantation of this verse, scatter, as from the unextinguished hearth, ashes and sparks, my words among mankind. Be through my lips to unawakened earth the trumpet of a prophecy. O wind, if winter comes, can spring be far behind? So what I find so fascinating about this poem is its incantatory power. The way in which that tersa rima I talked about is not about making an argument through logic. It's not about reason. It's making an argument through sound. Right? If I were to ask you, if you like, I don't know, any kind of music, what the argument of a song was, it'd be very hard for you to tell me, even if it had an argument, even if the argument was I don't know, Fortunate Son by Creedence Clearwater Revival. Okay, the argument is that rich people don't have to go into the draft, and poor people like me do have to fight in Vietnam, right? Sure, but that really doesn't do justice to the song. You have to hear the progressions. You have to hear the sound of the guitar. You have to hear the sound of J.C. Fogarty's voice almost breaking every time he sings it ain't me, right? You have to hear that. It doesn't work without the sound. If you listen to Public Enemy, and without those wild swoops of weird, like, overdubbing, sampling craziness, it doesn't work. It's not as scary. It's not as hectic. It doesn't hit you. This poem is exactly the same way. He's actually using sound to call forth the spirit. That's the only way I understand it. Because he says, in all three, as I write up here, the first stanza, all he says basically, if you follow just follow the syntax of the sentence. Blah, 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 blah. Hear me. Blah, 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 blah. Hear me. Like, listen, right? Hey, do you remember what in Jakobson's like little theory, what it was called when you were trying to connect? Remember, when you're trying to connect when the poet. Do you guys remember anybody from my first class? It's called It's called the phatic mode in linguistic terms. Phatic. All right. What this means is testing. 1, 2, 3. Right? Right. 3. Testing. Right? It's the place where the poet is trying to make contact. In this case, not with us so much, but with his spirit. Right? The phatic. It's just a mode, right? And he's a structural linguist we're dealing with in the first theory class, which is driving us crazy. But testing, 1, 2, 3. Testing, 1, 2, 3. Like, wait, I need your attention right now. I'm really leaving you. I know I've said this many times before, but I need your attention. I'm going out the door. I've already packed my bags. I've already went to another apartment. It was great. You're wonderful, but I can't do it. I'm leaving. But I need your attention first. Like, are you listening to me? Because I know I've said this a lot. That's the phatic mode. The whole first 3 stanzas, the majority of the poem, it's only 5 stanzas long, just basically saying, hear me, hear me, hear me. Then once he gets that contact, what does he do with it? He says, make me you, but even more, be me. You be me. What's that line that's from the beginning of that Beatles song? It goes, I am he as you and we as something. It's bizarre, and then it's like we are all together. You know that song? But I don't know if you ever listened to that first line. It's bizarre. It's like Lennon going, he's probably like high, but he's basically going like, wait a minute. It's a Shelley moment. He's like going, maybe it was reading Shelley, maybe it was not. I am you as you are he, and he is we as we are all together, right? Like, that's what when he says, make me like you, west wind, you power, because I am like you. When I was a kid, I could run almost as fast as you. I had the imagining that you had. I wasn't so far from when I was a kid, I wasn't so far from that spiritual place. Now I am, right? But now I'm begging you to make you like me. And then in the last part, it's like, make me thy lyre. Oh no, this is the one where he says, be thou me. It's in the 5th one, I'm sorry. The second one is just like, I am like you. The last one is like, make me thy lyre. Remember, we've already talked about the lyre. Remember? The way the lyre, the thing for Shelley and for Coleridge is that the lyre is us and God blows through us, and we're all connected that way. That's how I can say I am we is because God blows through all of us. It's a wind, right? What if my leaves are falling like a stone? Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm like really old, and he was like 20, like whatever. He was like, oh, I'm getting so old now. I'm like, oh, shut up. Anyway, but and then he says, be thou spirit fierce, my spirit, be my spirit, and then be thou me, impetuous one. It's a weird one. Can you imagine saying that in prayer? I don't know if you pray or not, but if you say, okay, God, let me be attuned to thee. Okay, God, be me. It's a weird thing to say, right? But he means it. He means be me and in a certain sense, be me in order that my words, this poem, can scatter to the unawakened earth, right? So that my words can live long after me. My immortality comes through my words scattering through the wind. I like the figure, I mean, it's just Christian. I mean, there's no other way to understand it. Like Jesus says, just does the act, and then sort of it's all an offering. Yeah, that's the end of the poem. And if winter's coming, spirit of Advent, those who are Christian, part of the Christian count. This is a guy who obviously knew his Christian theology, right? Even though he was claims to be an atheist, right? Says, can spring be far behind? Can Easter be far behind if there's this, Advent happening? Okay. Any questions about this? So where is the political in this, Ruderman? You said there's no political in this. I don't know. I think that this prophecy he's talking about has to do with a kind of political movement. But maybe I could be pressing too hard here. Maybe this is completely his own ecstatic thing. For me, a little bit. It has a little bit of that air. I want to look at a poem that I did not give you, but it is the final Shelley poem that we'll do really quickly. And this is an opportunity for me to talk about, this is called England in 1819. And this is an opportunity for me to talk about the thing I was just mentioning really quickly before, this kind of open question about, do we live in a democracy, and did they live in a democracy, right? So in 1819, the Napoleonic Wars had been over since 1815. There were several economic hardships, but none of them were experienced by the people who were in control of the means of production. They were all experienced most by the poor, right? That's what tends to happen. And they were displaced on the poor. One of those things was the Corn Laws. Now, the Corn Laws were passed in order to make sure that that farmers were not getting undersold by imported grain. The problem was it meant that food prices were way out of control for average people, and they were on the verge of starving. So you had the Corn Laws, you had unemployment, you had the fact that huge parts of the country had no direct participation. No vote. That means not just they had no vote, they had no representation. Huge parts of the country, you can just imagine what it was like. Huge parts of the country had no direct participation, no vote. The place I'm going to talk about right now is a place called Manchester, England. I was just there last year for the 200th anniversary of what is called Peterloo. And Peterloo was a massacre that happened in Manchester of protesters, peaceful protesters, that happened in St. Peter's Square in the heart of Manchester, which was an industrial city. At the time, it was just becoming industrial. It had been a major sort of hub for a lot of local agrarian businesses and such to come and sell their wares. It was starting to become industrialized at this point in 1819. But it had no representation. Yes?
Is that name Peterloo, is that kind of like a play on the Battle of Waterloo?
It's absolutely a play on the Battle of Waterloo, right? So that's how they come up with the name Peterloo. Shelley writes a poem called Mask of Anarchy and sends it back, because he's in Italy, remember, when this happens. It's an outraged poem, a really beautiful poem. In fact, it's a poem that the British government still uses part of the poem as part of, I don't know what it is, but maybe it's part of the labor song or something like that, where it says something about shake your, rise like lions, shake your chains, we are many, they are few. That's the line from Mask of Anarchy. Perhaps the first poem ever to propose nonviolent direct civil disobedience. Lay down in front of their horses, let them trample you, because we will rise up. That's the basic understanding of the poem, right? So, and we would read it, except it's long. And again, I'm stuck with this, so we're not reading Mask of Anarchy. Peterloo happens. Basically, I'll give you the shortest story I can give. They asked for permission to have a peaceful protest to try to get direct participation, somebody that will represent them in Parliament and in the House of Lords and in the House of Commons. The people that are in charge there, the magistrates, they're just aristocrats that are put in charge of that area. So they also own the businesses, they also own everything in the area, and they say, no, you cannot have this. And they decide to go ahead anyway. Now, it wasn't like they could pick up a phone and call to London and say, what should we do? So they send a courier and they say, okay, we're a little bit worried, because they're going to have this march. It might be that we need to have some security forces. Okay, well, who do they get to be the security forces? They get these guys called the yeomanry. They were a part-time police force. The yeomanry was a kind of class of people. They were basically like peasants who also owned land. They didn't have any rights beyond that, and they considered themselves sort of above this other class. So the working class has this big thing. They plan it out. They have people coming from hundreds of miles around. They had tens of thousands of people to hear this one guy come and speak. But he gets up there to speak, and they actually decided they would not take weapons in. No weapons. We're going to be peaceful. So they left their weapons aside. They go into the main square. The magistrates are looking from an upper window. You can actually see the square from. I've been there. It's like the Quaker House where I had this meeting is still there. Where I had this was at a conference. So they're looking down at this thing and they're going, what should we do? I don't know. Should we call in? And they're like, yeah, call them in and arrest the main speakers. So they go in to arrest the main speakers. They pretty much trample everybody in their way on these horses, and they come in, and with a sword they say, I arrest these speakers. Well, people started throwing things, right? People started getting upset. And then these guys just tore loose. So you had the army there, and you had this yeomanry. In some cases, the army got in front of the yeomanry and said, stop hacking that woman to death, right? Just stop. And they were drunk, also, was the other part of it, that they were largely drunk, right? Which is not uncommon. It's Sunday afternoon. They're going, they're hacking people, and the army. So in the end, 19 people are killed, hundreds wounded, and that's the basis for. It took a long time, but it's one of the bases for finally getting participatory democracy through more of the country, not to everybody, not yet to the Catholics. God knows, not yet to the Jews, but to more of the country. To some people that didn't own land, to some people that were, in Manchester, finally got representation. But not until 1832. That's how long the fight went on, okay? So this is the background for this poem, okay? Does somebody else want to read this? Can somebody else read this for me? Because I'm feeling, yeah, please. You're going to have to read it off here, can you?
Yeah.
Okay, it's just a sonnet, so that's it.
An old, mad, blind, despised, and dying king, princes, the dregs of their dull race, who flow through public scorn, mud from a muddy spring, rulers who neither see nor feel nor know, but leech-like to their fainting country cling till they drop, blind in blood, without a blow. A people starved and stabbed in the untilled field, an army whom liberticide and prey makes as a two-edged sword to all who wield, golden in sanguine laws which tempt and slay, religion Christless, godless, a book sealed, a senate, time's worst statute, unrepealed, are braised from which a glorious phantom may burst to illuminate our tempestuous day.
Good, great, thank you, very good. All right, yeah, questions? So it's a pretty, it was also not published in 1819. It took a while for this poem to get published as well. This is published posthumously. He dies, I think, in 1822. And the king died, and the king was mad, he was syphilitic. But I mean, it's not, the king had nothing to do with what happened in Manchester. I mean, except for the structures that were there. But you can see each one of these, you see how, this is what I wanted to get at, I think. Do you see how in this poem, the language tends towards the ecstatic? Even as it's describing this bloody thing, it still tends towards the ecstatic. It's almost as though he cannot help himself but have this kind of, I don't know, this kind of redemption poetics inside of each of his works. It's almost a sound value, right? When I was listening when you were singing, you know, the way the chiming, sometimes the rhymes don't chime and sometimes they do. Golden and sanguine laws which tempt and slay, religion Christless, godless, a book sealed, a senate, time's worst statute unrepealed. When they do chime like that, when unrepealed and sealed kind of really stand out, it's as though what he's doing is bringing the clergy and the Senate together in one, you know, fell swoop of criticism, like both nothing, you know, you're both part of the old story, which will be overturned when, from the graves of these martyred people on St. Peter's Square, the phantom of the new revolution bursts forth, or whatever he wants to think of it, you know, right? The glorious phantom may burst to illumine our tempestuous day. Okay. I can't say enough. Read Shelley. He's great. Any questions about this? Just want to show you how you cannot separate these two things in him. They just are there. Okay, we're going to turn to a very different thinker and writer now. We're going to turn to John Keats. He was friends with Shelley. Friends, that's too much. He knew Shelley. He met Shelley. Keats was really the baby of the group and never really was completely accepted in any way. So Shelley's poems, by the way, his first book of poems and his second book of poems were completely attacked by the critics. Completely attacked as immoral, as unpoetic, as whatever. Keats's first book of poems was put down similarly for different reasons. His were put down because they were not strong enough. He had too effeminate a voice. Now, part of what they're doing with Keats, when they talk about, it's interesting, Keats is a lower middle class poet. And I think that class dynamics play some part in this. He did not know Latin and Greek, unlike all the other poets we read. He did not know Latin and Greek. And by the way, I don't know Greek at all, and my Latin is horrible. So today you don't need to know. Back then you needed to know Latin and Greek to be a real poet. And he didn't. He didn't have it. He came from a working background. His father died when he was youngish. His stepfather owned a stable/bar, and that was how he grew up. And he was actually on his way to becoming a kind of surgeon's helper. He was training in medicine when he fell in love with poetry, and then he nursed his brother who had tuberculosis while his brother died, while his brother Tom died. And he realized that there was a very good chance that he would also die of this disease, since it was basically, basically, if you were, I would have died of the same disease because I have very weak lungs, right? So if I lived in London at this time, I would have died to pre-penicillin. Right? And the conditions were so horrible. I talked to you about the pollution in London, I think, when we talked about Blake. The conditions were just so horrible. But in any case, he decides to really devote himself to poetry. And when he really devotes himself to poetry, he joins up with this guy I talked about before, Leigh Hunt. He meets William Hazlitt. He very quickly moves into these circles. And as he moves into these circles, he is taken in, at first because he can write a good sonnet. That was a big deal. If you could write a good sonnet, you were a good poet. Here's one of his sonnets. We'll just read it really quickly. When I have fears that I may cease to be, is basically a rewriting of a John Milton sonnet in a way, but he does it in a completely new way. When I have fears that I may cease to be, before my pen has gleaned my teeming brain, before high-piloted books in charactery hold like rich garners the full ripened grain, when I behold upon the night's starred face huge cloudy symbols of a high romance, and think that I may never live to trace their shadows with the magic hand of chance, and when I feel, fair creature of an hour, that I shall never look upon thee more, never have relish in the fairy power of unreflecting love, then on the shore of the wide world I stand alone and think, till love and fame to nothingness do sink. So he's a good poet. He's really a fine poet at this point. The poem that kind of got him, that first was published in the newspapers, is called On First Looking into Chapman's Homer. That's the first one that really got him. It also had this image of standing someplace and looking out. This perspective view seems to be something he's interested in. In a few years, in 1 year, he will begin his great odes. And when he begins writing his great odes, Ode to a Nightingale, Ode on Melancholy, Ode in a Grecian Urn, that's when Keats becomes Keats, right? He totally finds a style, a form, that becomes completely his. That's actually something, I left my reading notes somewhere, but that's actually something I wanted to touch on in terms of both of these poems. So if you take, let's talk about both of them for just 1 second before we turn to Ode on a Grecian Urn. Shelley and Keats so I'm going to kind of go back to what I said before, where I said that the logic was in the sound. I want to enclose sound within form. So I want to basically say that the logic is in the form for both of these writers. So unless you really appreciate the form, you're not going to necessarily appreciate the true beauty of the work. That's what I think when we looked at Ode to the West Wind, you could see that, right? That there was something about the very form of how it lays itself, structures its argument, that is really beautiful and is its own logic. So the logic is in the form, and the form that Keats comes up with is an ode form. And we'll look at Ode on a Grecian Urn, so if you can turn to that. Let me just warn you not to pay attention because I am lazy. I'm a lazy person sometimes and forgetful. Actually, I'm not lazy at all. I work like crazy, but I don't always work on the right. I do too much. But basically, I should have never given you this crappy version of this form. Whenever you see this line here, that ecstasy is not supposed to be set alone. That belongs in the line previous. Okay. So just you see what I mean? I took it out of a book that had them formed so close that they crushed the lines in and pushed it over, and the stupid typesetters did it. But you can count to figure that out, right? You can say, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and this says 10 here, so that means this belongs there. Okay? So, basically, the ode form in English language usually meant to resolve. It's supposed to resolve in some kind of way. And it's always a partial resolution. It's never a complete resolution. It's not like, da 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 da. It always is kind of like, oh, it's kind of resolves, but it doesn't quite resolve. Keats comes along with his odes, and they have the structure of resolution, but nothing changes. We're going to encounter this again and again. It's a kind of modern, and I know that it's weird to call Romanticism a modern movement, but it's a kind of modern way of thinking about pushing form against itself. So you have something that's the form of something, but it does something different. So when you read his odes, they very rarely actually go anywhere. Ode to a Nightingale begins with him feeling kind of confused and lonely, and it kind of ends with him feeling confused and lonely. And this poem begins talking about an urn. An urn that had been, no doubt, uncovered in one of the many archaeological expeditions that the British did to Egypt and to Saudi Arabia and to whatever. Basically, they stole a bunch of shit that wasn't theirs, and they brought it back and they put it in the museums. And everybody came to look at it, and they said, "Oh, we love Roman and Greek work. We love antiquity so much." But it wasn't really theirs, right? So that's what they did. And this urn thing looked like this. It had little people painted on it. And probably there's a cow, so a heifer. I don't know how to draw a cow. I'm going to draw a dog that looks like a cow, maybe. Whatever, it's like something like that. I don't know, has a face. Yeah, that definitely looks like a dog. But this thing, cow. That cow is on the thing, right? So he's looking at this. Now, remember I said that Keats is not wealthy. He's probably not even looking at the original urn. Because Thomas Wedgwood, the great inventor of China and all that stuff, was living in that time in, where was he living? He was living somewhere in England, Bristol. He was living in Bristol, and he had a factory, and they reproduced these famous artworks so that you could have a Grecian urn in your home. So he was probably looking at that. Probably wasn't actually in the museum looking at it. We do know he saw the Elgin marbles, so he did go to the museum, and he loved art, but he goes and he sees this. So let's do this poem, and then I'll talk very briefly about the letter on negative capability, and then we'll have to end for the day, and then I'll pick up negative capability just a tiny bit at the beginning on Monday, talk about Claire, and we'll jump into Victorian poetry, okay? Hey, let's do it this way. Let me read the first stanza, and then we'll just kind of go like this and like this, so that each person reads a stanza, and then it goes to someone else. Okay? And if you don't know the words or how to pronounce them, don't worry. Just do your best. Okay? Thou still unravished bride of quietness, thou foster child of silence and slow time, sylvan historian, who canst thus express a flowery tale more sweetly than our rhyme, what leaf-fringed legend haunts about thy shape of deities or mortals or both, in Tempe or the dales of Arcady? What men or gods are these? What maidens loth? What mad pursuits? What struggle to escape? What pipes and timbrels? What wild ecstasy?
Heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter. Therefore, ye soft pipes, play on, not to the sensual ear, but more endeared, pipe to the spirit ditties of no tone. Fair youth beneath the trees, thou canst not leave thy song, nor ever can. Those trees be bare, bold lover, never, never canst thou kiss. Though winning near the goal, yet do not grieve, she cannot fade, though thou hast not thy bliss, forever wilt thou love, and be she fair.
Happy, happy boughs that cannot shed your leaves nor ever bid the spring adieu. And happy melodists unwearied, forever piping songs forever new. More happy love, more happy, happy love. Forever warm and still to be enjoyed, forever painting and forever young, all breathing human passion far above, that leaves a heart high sorrowful and cloyed, a burning forehead and a parching tongue.
Who are these coming to the sacrifice? To what green altar, O mysterious priest, leadst thou Hector, lowering at the skies, and all her sylvan flanks with garlands dressed? What little town by the river or seashore, or mountain built with peaceful citadel, is empty of this folk, this pious morn? And little town, thy streets forevermore will silent be, and not a soul to tell why thou art desolate can ever return.
O Attic shape, fair attitude, with breed of marble men and maidens overwrought, with forest branches in the trodden weed, thou, silent form, dost to tease us out of thought, as doth eternity, called pastoral. When old age shall this generation waste, thou shalt remain, in midst of other woe than ours, a friend to man, to whom thou sayest, beauty is truth, truth, beauty, that is all ye know on earth, and all ye need to know.
Great, excellent. Thank you, everybody. Beauty is truth, truth, beauty. Okay. This is a very controversial ending to this poem, largely because two versions of the poem exist. One of these has this in quotation marks, as though the urn is saying it, and the other one has it without quotation marks, as though the speaker is saying it. And so it's very unclear whether Keats himself believes that beauty equals truth, or if this ancient urn makes that claim for beauty. You see the difference, right? So it's a very controversial claim. I tend to think that there's something in Keats that follows this line of thinking. And what that means for us is we can see suddenly how Keats is somewhat not anti-Wordsworthian, but counter-Wordsworthian. Because for Wordsworth, beauty was great, but truth was not necessarily equal to beauty, right? And so this is the opposition. So with this opposition, let's just take up this letter that he writes the letter on negative capability. Keats's letters are the closest we have to his poetics. So those of us who love his poetry, we return over and over to the things he said in his letters to help us explain what he thought about poetry. Because unlike Shelley and Byron and Wordsworth and Coleridge and even Blake, he did. All right. So this letter is actually, I believe it's, I've researched this. I believe it was written on my birthday, but like that's maybe about even older than me, 1817. But he goes on to he begins by discussing a painting that he had seen called Death on a Pale Horse. The painting looks like this. He goes and he sees this painting by Benjamin West, an American living in London who was what's called at the time a history painter. Those of you who know anything about art history know that this comes out of the French tradition. The idea is that if you paint a kind of like big, amazing scene, this will kind of speak not only to the history of what happened, but will kind of stir up the kind of national feeling and the people seeing it for a kind of great moment of usually national feeling. That was so. It was used in the prior to the French Revolution. It was used to kind of prop up the king and that position, the monarchy. After the French Revolution, especially by people like David, it was used to prop up the revolution. Art tends to be the approved art tends to be the art of whoever wins the war, right? So that becomes the approved art. So we have like Washington crossing the Delaware as a history painting. You know what I'm talking about? That one, right? So that's an example. This it's hard to know, but it's a classical scene. I think in a moment when you know, a kind of expatriate American living in England is trying to think about like how to talk about the kind of problems in the empire, he might try to encourage it through a kind of very inspiring painting like this. But this is what he says about it. He says, there's nothing to be intense upon, no woman one feels mad to kiss, no face swelling into reality. The excellence of every art is its intensity, capable of making all disagreeables evaporate from their being in close relationship with beauty and truth. Okay, so there you have those words again. So intensity becomes the term that can kind of meld together beauty and truth, right? So intensity, and he gets this from Hazlitt. Remember the same guy who talked about gusto, remember I said before? He has this word he says over and over again and talks about intensity. So for Keats, the intensity of a work of art, its kind of like energy is so important. And for him, because it's kind of, I don't know, it's kind of classical and restrained in a way, even though it's like very energetic. I don't know if people know French art, but it looks a little like he was inspired by Delacroix. Delacroix, I don't know quite how to say the Delacroix is. But anyway, it's just all this sort of whatever, but it doesn't have that intensity for Keats, right? And now, so this is the part I want you to get at. So then he goes on to talk about how Shakespeare's King Lear is so great because it has this intensity. It's aiming high, but then he says, I had not a dispute, but a disquisition with Doka, another one of the friends, right? There's Brown, there was Doka, there was, it doesn't matter, Severin, there were other people hanging around. I had a disquisition with Doka on various subjects. Several things dovetailed in my mind, and at once it struck me what quality went in to form a man of achievement, especially a man in literature, and which Shakespeare possessed so enormously. I mean negative capability. That is, when a man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact for reason. That part right there, I almost want you to commit to memory. right? Negative capability becomes a very, very important concept throughout the 19th century in British literature and British art. And in general, right up to the present day. Negative capability is still a very powerful idea in aesthetic theory. I even read recently a work of psychoanalytic theory, and they were talking about negative capability from Keats, right? And poets still talk about it all the time. So what is it? It's the ability to be in mysteries. I mean, he says it pretty clearly there. When a man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact or reason. And then he goes on to slag Coleridge, which I think is a little bit unfair. It is true that Coleridge never can stop thinking, right? So he never stops qualifying everything they said. On the other hand, I think, but that was just because he was a great talker, a great thinker. His wheels were always turning. For Keats, it is absolutely important, in order to capture the intensity, that you learn to tolerate not having all the answers. And a great art is, in fact, about creating a kind of space where intensity can form beauty and truth into a kind of object, a kind of form that we can then take on. Now I'll return to this, but are there any questions right now about this? All right. We'll go have a negatively capable weekend, and I will see you next week. Read. Grab one of these on your way out, okay?